The colonial ruling class, American independence, and the architecture of white supremacy, WHO actually ran the 13 colonies. Forget the civics textbook framing. The 13 colonies were not communities of freedom-seeking pilgrims building a new world. They were extraction operations, corporate and crown ventures designed to move wealth upward into the hands of a small, interconnected landed aristocracy. By the mid-1700s, colonial society had already crystallized into a rigid class hierarchy. The planter class, Virginia, Maryland, the Carolinas, Georgia. Families like the Washingtons, Lees, Byrds, Carters, and Randolphs. They didn't just own land, they owned tens of thousands of acres worked by hundreds of enslaved people. George Washington owned over 300 enslaved people. Thomas Jefferson owned over 600 across his lifetime. These men weren't gentlemen farmers. They were lords operating feudal plantation economies, and their entire social order depended on the permanent, heritable, racial enslavement of African people. The merchant class, New England and the mid-Atlantic. The Hancocks, Otises, Adamses, Livingstons, Morrises. They controlled trade, shipping, banking, and import-export. A massive portion of their wealth was directly tied to the slave trade triangle. Molasses, rum, slaves, and to supplying the plantation economy with goods. John Hancock's family fortune was built largely on trade, including commerce that intersected directly with slavery, the lawyer intellectual class, the ideological infrastructure, men like Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin. Their job, whether they articulated it this way or not, was to construct a philosophical and legal framework that justified the power structure already in place while making it sound universal. These three factions overlapped heavily through marriage, business, and shared interest. They were not ideologically uniform, they disagreed constantly, but they shared one foundational commitment: the preservation of their property, their class position, and their racial dominance. Why independence? The real reasons. The official story: taxation without representation, tyranny, freedom. The actual story is more specific and considerably darker. 1. The Proclamation of 176, after the French and Indian War. Britain issued the Proclamation of 1763, forbidding colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. The stated reason was to prevent conflict with native nations. The real effect: it locked the colonial land speculating class out of the most valuable asset on the continent, Western land. Washington, Jefferson, Patrick Henry, and others were already deeply invested in land speculation schemes targeting trans-Appalachian territory. The Ohio Company, the Mississippi Company, the Loyal Company. These were elite colonial ventures that the proclamation directly threatened. Independence meant the British Crown could no longer stop them from seizing and selling native land. 2. The Somerset Decision, 1772. This is the one historians consistently underemphasize. In 1772, the British court ruled in Somerset v. Stuart that slavery was not supported by English common law and that an enslaved man brought to England could not be forcibly returned to slavery. The ruling didn't immediately abolish slavery in the colonies, but its implications terrified the planter class. Lord Dunmore's proclamation in 1775, issued by the British governor of Virginia, promised freedom to any enslaved person who escaped a rebel slaveholder and joined British forces. Thousands of enslaved people took him up on it. The planter class understood clearly: a British victory likely meant the eventual dissolution of their entire economic and social order. Independence was, in significant part, a defense of slavery. Historian Gerald Horne's The Counter-Revolution of 1776 documents this argument in granular detail. The American Revolution, from this angle, was not a revolution toward freedom. It was a counter-revolution against the rising tide of British abolitionism. 3. Debt and taxation. The British taxation schemes, Stamp Act, Townshend Acts, Tea Act, were genuinely resented, but the resentment was specifically class-shaped. These taxes hit merchants and the propertied class. The British also expected the colonies to help pay for a war, the French and Indian War, that the colonies had partly caused through their own expansionist aggression. The merchant class transformed their specific financial grievance into a universal language of liberty. Taxation without representation was never about poor colonists. It was about wealthy men who didn't want to be taxed by a parliament they didn't control. 4. Control of currency. Britain's Currency Act of 1764 prohibited colonies from issuing their own paper money. Colonial economies depended on local currency. The British restriction caused economic contraction that directly hit the merchant class. Benjamin Franklin, in testimonies before Parliament, identified currency control as a primary driver of colonial discontent. The construction of whiteness in colonial America. This is where it gets structurally crucial, because what the ruling class built wasn't just a nation, it was a racial taxonomy designed to prevent class solidarity among the poor. Before Bacon's Rebellion, 1676, class was the primary fault line. Poor European indentured servants and enslaved Africans worked side by side, lived together, ran away together, and occasionally revolted together. The planter class of Virginia was genuinely terrified of this multiracial laboring class. Bacon's Rebellion, in which poor white indentured servants, free black people, and enslaved people joined together under Nathaniel Bacon to fight the colonial government, crystallized the threat. Though Bacon himself was a wealthy planter using poor people as cannon fodder for his own land ambitions, the cross-racial alliance of the laboring poor is what the elite took away as the danger signal. The response was the deliberate construction of race as a legal and social category. Virginia began systematically closing off pathways to freedom for black people while expanding rights for European servants. The 1705 Virginia Slave Codes codified heritable racial slavery. If your mother was enslaved, you were enslaved, regardless of your father. Poor white men were given specific material incentives: the right to patrol, the right to testify in court, small land grants, legal standing that black people, free or enslaved, were explicitly denied. The category of white was invented as a legal status. It didn't exist in Virginia law before the late 17th century. Irish, English, German, and other European laborers weren't white. They were English, Irish, German. The consolidation into white was a political project. Theodore Allen's The Invention of the White Race and Edmund Morgan's American Slavery, American Freedom both document this architecture in detail. The core thesis, racial solidarity, was manufactured by the ruling class as a substitute for class solidarity. Give poor European workers just enough psychological and legal elevation above black people, and they'll identify upward with the planter class rather than sideways with other poor people. The founding documents as class protection instruments. The Declaration of Independence declares, "All men are created equal," written by a man who enslaved hundreds of people and never freed them in his lifetime. This isn't hypocrisy in the simple sense, it's precision. Men meant propertied men. Equal meant equal among the propertied class, not equal across humanity. The Constitution is even more explicit. The 3/5 clause. Enslaved people counted as 3/5 of a person for apportionment purposes. This increased the political power of slaveholding states in the House and Electoral College, without giving enslaved people any rights. It was a gift to the planter class. The Fugitive Slave Clause constitutionally mandated the return of escaped enslaved people across state lines. Slavery wasn't a regional quirk. It was federally protected in the founding document. The Electoral College, designed explicitly to buffer the selection of the executive from direct democracy. The founders were openly contemptuous of mass democracy. Madison, in Federalist No. 10, explicitly argued that the constitutional structure was designed to protect property-owning minorities from the faction of the majority. The Senate, equal representation by state regardless of population, specifically designed to give small slaveholding states disproportionate power. The Bill of Rights, the Second Amendment's well-regulated militia clause, was substantially about slave patrols and the right of slaveholding states to maintain armed forces to suppress enslaved uprisings. Patrick Henry said this directly during the Virginia ratification debates. The Constitution did not fail to protect black people. It was designed to protect the class that enslaved them. White assimilation as political engineering. The pressure toward white assimilation wasn't incidental. It was structural and deliberate, operating on multiple levels simultaneously. Phase 1. The colonial and early republic period. The early republic needed bodies. It needed settlers to occupy native land, soldiers to fight native people, farmers to work territory, and laborers to build infrastructure. It did not need those bodies forming cross-racial alliances that might threaten the property-owning class. The solution? Extend the psychological and legal franchise of whiteness broadly to European immigrants, while simultaneously constructing black people as the permanent bottom caste. Germans, Scots-Irish, and other non-English European groups were gradually incorporated into the white category through a process of cultural assimilation and legal recognition. The price of admission was participation in the racial order, accepting the premise of black inferiority, supporting slave patrols, taking up arms against native peoples, and eventually fighting to preserve the Union, or the Confederacy, as a white nation. Phase 2. 19th century immigration waves. When the Irish began arriving in massive numbers after the 1840s famine, they were not initially considered white by the Anglo-Protestant establishment. They were depicted in popular press as simian, savage, and racially inferior, language nearly identical to anti-black racism. The Irish made a calculated, collective decision to assimilate into whiteness. They joined police forces, which functioned largely as instruments of black suppression in northern cities. They opposed abolition. They participated in anti-black riots, most infamously the New York draft riots of 1863, where Irish mobs lynched black men and burned a black orphanage. The riots were substantially about Irish workers' terror that emancipated black labor would compete with them, a fear the ruling class deliberately cultivated. The same pattern repeated with Italians, Eastern European Jews, and other Southern Eastern European groups who arrived in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Each group was initially racialized as non-white or semi-white, then gradually incorporated into whiteness through participation in anti-black racial projects and acceptance of the racial order. Noel Ignatiev's How the Irish Became White and David Roediger's The Wages of Whiteness document this process in exhaustive detail. The core mechanism: whiteness was a wage, not a cash wage, a psychological and social wage. The sense of status, superiority, and distance from blackness that whiteness conferred was compensation offered in lieu of actual material solidarity with other working-class people. Phase 3. The 20th century consolidation. By the early 20th century, the New Deal and post-World War II economic boom represented the full incorporation of European immigrant groups into white America, but deliberately, structurally, on terms that excluded black people. The GI Bill, 1944, provided college education, low-interest home loans, and business startup capital, but was administered through local institutions that excluded black veterans in most of the country. The FHA mortgage program created white suburban home ownership as the foundation of middle-class wealth accumulation, through explicit redlining that confined black families to depreciating urban zones. Labor unions, the mechanism of white ethnic working class advancement, systematically excluded black workers through the mid-20th century. The wealth gap between white and black Americans that exists today is not a residue of slavery alone. It is the compounded result of deliberate post-slavery exclusion from every major wealth-building program the federal government created. What the native population experienced during all of this is a parallel genocide that the white assimilation project depended on entirely. The entire economic logic of colonial expansion required land. Land required the removal, displacement, or extermination of the people already on it. The newly white European immigrants were recruited into this project directly, offered land grants and homestead rights on territory, seized through military force, broken treaties, and biological warfare. The 1830 Indian Removal Act under Andrew Jackson, a slaveholder and land speculator, authorized the forced relocation of the 5 civilized tribes from the southeast. The Cherokee Nation had a constitution, a written language, newspapers, and a legal system. It didn't matter. The Trail of Tears killed roughly a quarter of the Cherokee population. The Homestead Act of 186 too gave 160 acres of public land to settlers. Land that was public only because it had been seized from native nations. It was a direct subsidy to white family wealth built on native dispossession. Black people were largely excluded from benefiting from it. By the late 19th century, the reservation system had confined native populations to the least arable, least resource-rich land in the country, after oil, gold, and other resources had already been stripped, and the boarding school system was actively destroying native language, culture, and identity in children forcibly separated from their families. The new Americans, freshly assimilated into whiteness, were the foot soldiers of this project. The ruling class provided the legal architecture. Newly white settlers provided the labor of dispossession. The aftermath. What the system produced. By 1865, the Confederacy was militarily defeated, but the planter class was not destroyed. Reconstruction, the only genuine attempt to build a multiracial democracy in American history, was systematically dismantled through paramilitary terror. The KKK, the Red Shirts, the White League were organized, armed, and politically connected efforts to murder black political leadership and terrorize black voters. The Compromise of 1877, federal troops withdrawn from the South in exchange for Hayes winning the presidency. The deal ended Reconstruction and handed the South back to its former slaveholding class, who reinstituted racial domination through law rather than ownership. Convict leasing, the 13th Amendment's exception clause, except as punishment for crime, was immediately weaponized. Black men were arrested on vagrancy charges and leased to plantations, mines, and railroads. Slavery, by another name, constitutionally protected. Jim Crow, a comprehensive legal apartheid system that persisted for 90 years after the Civil War, until the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and Voting Rights Act of 1965, both of which have since been systematically weakened by the Supreme Court. The ruling class that founded the United States did not lose power after independence. It expanded its power, adapted its mechanisms, and passed its advantages through compounding wealth, legal architecture, and cultural narrative to its descendants. The bottom line, the United States was not founded as a democracy that fell short of its ideals. It was founded as a racial oligarchy that used the language of universal freedom as ideological cover for a system of wealth extraction built on 1. The permanent enslavement and dehumanization of African people. 2. The genocide and dispossession of native people. 3. The deliberate manufacture of racial identity to prevent cross-racial class solidarity. 4. The selective extension of whiteness to European immigrant groups as a mechanism of political control. 5. The construction of legal and financial systems that compounded white wealth and compounded black and native dispossession across generations. The men who designed this system were not naive idealists. They were sophisticated political operators who understood exactly what they were building. The gap between the rhetoric and the reality was not a contradiction, it was a feature. The rhetoric provided moral legitimacy. The reality served material interest. Every major subsequent struggle in American history, abolition, Reconstruction, labor organizing, civil rights, voting rights, has been a struggle against the system these men built, often by people whose ancestors were the system's primary victims. That's the unvarnished architecture of it.